Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes, the serial killer who shocked Latin America.
Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes, the serial killer who shocked Latin America. Introduction: the monster who vanished. Pedro Alonso López is a name that remains one of the darkest mysteries in true crime history. Dubbed the monster of the Andes, he is suspected of being one of the most prolific serial offenders the world has ever seen. He claimed to have taken the lives of over 300 young victims across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru during the 1970s. Yet, his crimes did not receive the same level of international recognition as other infamous criminals. Unlike many others, López did not leave behind a clear trail of evidence. Instead, he preyed on vulnerable individuals in overlooked communities, operating in silence. His story is one of psychological manipulation, evasion, and shocking brutality, all within regions where law enforcement struggled to keep up with the scale of his offenses. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is his disappearance. After being convicted in Ecuador, he served a shockingly short prison sentence before being released in 1998, and then he vanished. Some believe he changed his identity and continued his crimes, while others speculate he was met with vigilante justice. The truth remains a mystery, and the question still lingers: where is Pedro Alonso López today? This investigative deep dive explores his background, his psychological profile, and the gaps in the justice system that allowed him to operate for years without consequence. We will examine the key factors that shaped his path, the devastating impact on his victims, and the chilling possibility that he may still be out there. Join us as we uncover the shocking case of Pedro Alonso López, the monster of the Andes. A shadow over the Andes. Pedro Alonso López's early life was defined by hardship, neglect, and circumstances that shaped his path into darkness. Born in 1948 in Tolima, Colombia, he grew up in a struggling household, one of 13 children. His mother, a woman forced to make difficult choices to survive, was unable to provide the stability or guidance a child needs. The harsh realities of his upbringing left scars that would later manifest in ways no one could have predicted. From an early age, López exhibited troubling behavior. At just 8 years old, he was caught engaging in petty theft. His mother's response was swift and unforgiving. She threw him out of the house. Suddenly homeless, he was left to navigate the unforgiving streets alone, seeking food and shelter wherever he could find them. But life on the streets was even more dangerous than the world he had left behind. Vulnerable and desperate, he was lured in by a man who promised him safety, only to betray him in the most horrifying way. This early trauma played a critical role in shaping his worldview, one where power was survival and trust was a liability. He had learned the cruelest lesson of all. In a world filled with predators, the only way to survive was to become one. As he grew older, López drifted through various cities, committing small crimes to get by. Eventually, he found his way to an orphanage run by missionaries. For a moment, it seemed like his life might take a different path. However, his troubling tendencies resurfaced, and when he was caught attempting to harm another child, he was expelled. Once again, he found himself alone, with no support system and no direction. With nowhere else to turn, López began engaging in more serious crimes. As a teenager, he developed a pattern of manipulation and deception, traits that would later help him evade capture for so long. His first run-ins with the law came in the form of theft, but it was only a matter of time before his crimes escalated. His first significant prison sentence came in his early 20s, and it was here that his transformation accelerated. In the brutal environment of the prison system, he was no longer a petty criminal, he became a survivor in the harshest sense. Accounts from those who later investigated his case suggest that he experienced extreme violence behind bars, an experience that further desensitized him to human suffering. According to reports, after enduring repeated attacks, he retaliated, ensuring that he would never again be seen as weak. Upon his release, López emerged with a new mindset driven by dominance, control, and a thirst for something far darker than material gain. His days of simple theft were over. He was no longer content with taking objects. Now, he wanted complete power over life itself. As he wandered across South America, a silent predator honing his methods, his crimes escalated. His ability to blend in and manipulate others made him particularly dangerous. He knew how to gain trust, how to remain unnoticed, and most chillingly, how to disappear without a trace after each act of violence. Over the next few years, young girls from vulnerable communities began to disappear. The connection was not immediately made, as the victims came from impoverished backgrounds where law enforcement often overlooked missing person reports. This allowed Lopez to continue undetected, refining his methods and evading capture. The Andes, with its vast and isolated landscapes, became his perfect hunting ground. He moved seamlessly across borders, knowing that the lack of communication between local authorities gave him a significant advantage. He had become more than just a criminal. He was a predator in the truest sense, waiting, watching, and choosing his victims with a methodical precision that would terrify investigators once the full scope of his crimes came to light. But his reign of terror wouldn't last forever. A single mistake, a moment of overconfidence would lead to his capture. And even then, justice would slip through the cracks in ways no one could have anticipated. The nightmare was just beginning, a path to darkness. By the time Pedro Alonso López reached adulthood, he had become a master of deception, learning how to manipulate those around him while keeping his true intentions hidden. After his expulsion from an orphanage due to troubling behavior, he drifted between towns, committing petty crimes and evading capture. But soon, he escalated to more serious offenses, laying the groundwork for the horrors to come. Learning to evade authorities, Lopez quickly realized that authorities were unlikely to pursue cases involving marginalized communities. This knowledge became his greatest advantage. He operated in areas where law enforcement was either ineffective or indifferent, knowing that his actions would not generate immediate suspicion. He understood how to disappear, how to avoid leaving evidence, and how to manipulate people into trusting him. A life of crime begins. During his early years, Lopez was arrested for stealing, leading to his first significant prison sentence. His time behind bars further shaped his psychology. He experienced extreme violence in prison, which, according to later accounts, only reinforced his belief in dominance and control. Rather than deterring him, this experience fueled his transformation into something far more dangerous. Upon his release, he did not attempt to reintegrate into society. Instead, he began moving across South America, refining his methods. He learned how to charm, how to disarm suspicion, and how to blend in wherever he went. By the time he crossed into Ecuador and Peru, he had already formed a disturbing pattern, targeting vulnerable young individuals who would not be missed by law enforcement. The escalation of his crimes. As he perfected his techniques, Lopez became bolder. His ability to evade capture gave him a sense of invincibility, and he believed he could continue indefinitely without consequence. His victims were chosen with precision: young girls from impoverished backgrounds, children who worked in markets or wandered the streets without supervision. His offers of food, gifts, or work made it easy for him to lure them away. No one realized a predator was walking among them. At least, not yet. The hunting grounds. By the mid-1970s, Pedro Alonso López had transformed into a dangerous predator, operating in complete anonymity across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. The vast Andean region provided the perfect setting: remote, poorly policed, and filled with vulnerable individuals who had little protection from the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Choosing his victims, Lopez developed a specific method for selecting his victims. He focused on young girls from impoverished backgrounds, those who spent their days working in markets or helping their families. These were individuals who would not be immediately missed, and their disappearances often went unreported for days or even weeks. He was a skilled manipulator, using kind words and small gifts to lure them away. He appeared harmless, sometimes posing as a man in need of help, a traveler looking for food, or a friendly stranger offering work opportunities. His ability to blend in made him even more dangerous. No one suspected the true intentions behind his actions, operating without suspicion. One of the most disturbing aspects of Lopez's crimes was his ability to remain undetected for so long. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for too long. When suspicions arose, he simply disappeared, moving to another town where no one knew his name. The lack of communication between law enforcement agencies across different countries allowed him to exploit gaps in the system, making it nearly impossible to track his movements. Authorities were slow to respond, dismissing reports of missing children as isolated incidents rather than recognizing a larger pattern. It wasn't until years later that investigators would begin to connect the disappearances across multiple regions, realizing that a single predator was responsible for hundreds of cases. The fear spreads. As the number of missing children grew, fear spread throughout the Andean communities. Families began to warn their children about talking to strangers. Markets, once bustling with life, became places of paranoia and caution. Yet, despite growing concerns, López continued to evade capture. He was methodical, careful, and above all, patient. He knew how to wait for the perfect opportunity, striking only when he was sure he could disappear without a trace. His reign of terror seemed unstoppable. But like all criminals who believe they are invincible, López would eventually make a mistake, and when he did, the world would finally begin to uncover the full extent of his crimes. Patterns of horror. Pedro Alonso López was not a reckless criminal. His actions followed a specific, chilling pattern known that allowed him to evade authorities for years. His ability to operate undetected made him one of the most elusive offenders in history. A methodical approach, López carefully selected his victims, targeting young girls from impoverished backgrounds. His strategy was calculated. He would observe their routines, gain their trust, and lure them away under false pretenses. His approach was so subtle that many victims vanished, without a single witness realizing what had happened. Authorities later determined that he operated in cycles. He would remain in one area for weeks or months, targeting multiple victims before suddenly disappearing. This ensured that when authorities finally began investigating a case, he had already moved to a different region, avoiding suspicion. One of the key reasons López was able to avoid capture for so long was his ability to blend in. He did not stand out in crowds. He spoke softly, dressed plainly, and appeared unthreatening. Locals rarely remembered seeing him, and even when they did, they had no reason to suspect he was involved in anything sinister. His ability to manipulate others extended to the authorities. If questioned, he would fabricate convincing stories about his background, portraying himself as a traveler, a worker, or even a victim of hardship. These lies often allowed him to escape serious scrutiny, buying him more time to continue his crimes. The scale of his crimes. Investigators now believe that López's offenses spanned at least 3 countries, possibly more. His victims numbered in the hundreds, making him one of the most prolific serial offenders in modern history. The sheer scale of his crimes, combined with the lack of attention from authorities at the time, allowed him to continue for far longer than most criminals. The fear he left behind. By the late 1970s, the communities in which he operated were gripped by fear. Families became more protective of their children, and markets, once lively and bustling, were now places of paranoia. Yet despite growing concerns, there was no clear suspect, no confirmed sightings, and no strong leads for law enforcement to pursue. López remained a phantom, a ghost moving between countries, leaving destruction in his wake. But like all criminals who believe they are untouchable, he would eventually make a mistake. And when he did, the world would finally begin to understand the true scale of his horrifying legacy. The first signs. By the late 1970s, stories of missing children had begun circulating in the towns and villages of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Parents warned their children not to speak to strangers, yet despite growing fears, no one had identified a suspect. The disappearances were treated as isolated incidents, and with limited resources, local authorities struggled to piece together the disturbing pattern. But there were signs, clues that something far more sinister was happening. Witness reports and close calls. As more children vanished, rumors began to spread about a mysterious man seen lingering in busy marketplaces. Some merchants recalled a stranger watching children, sometimes attempting to start friendly conversations. He was never aggressive, never forceful, just a man who seemed a little too interested in those around him. But in communities where people came and went daily, he remained unnoticed for far too long. One account described a young girl narrowly escaping an encounter. She later told her family that a man had approached her, offering gifts and food. When she hesitated, his demeanor shifted, his friendly tone disappeared. Sensing danger, she ran, disappearing into the crowd before he could follow. Though the story spread, no official investigation was launched. It was just another unsettling rumor in a region already battling poverty and crime. Discovery of evidence. The turning point came when heavy rains in Ambato, Ecuador, caused the earth to shift, revealing a shallow grave. A local farmer, walking through a remote area, stumbled upon remains partially exposed by the storm. Authorities arrived, uncovering more sites nearby, silent evidence of a predator who had been operating undetected for years. These discoveries sparked fear and outrage, but without a suspect, the community remained in a state of uncertainty. Who was responsible? How long had this been happening? And most disturbingly, where would he strike next? Authorities began to take notice. For the first time, law enforcement began looking at the disappearances as a connected case rather than isolated incidents. Reports of missing children were re-examined, timelines compared. Slowly, investigators began to see the pattern towns along major roads, victims fitting similar descriptions, and a suspect who seemed to vanish without a trace after each crime. Yet, despite growing suspicions, there was still no face, no name, no confirmed identity for the person behind it all. Lopez remained a ghost, always one step ahead of the authorities. But even the most elusive criminals make mistakes, and soon, Lopez would make his first crucial error that would bring him face to face with law enforcement for the first time. The hunt for the monster of the Andes was about to begin. The interrogation. At first, Lopez denied any wrongdoing. He maintained his innocence, claiming to be a simple man moving from town to town in search of work. But as investigators pressed him, inconsistencies in his story began to emerge. After hours of questioning, something changed. In a chilling turn, Lopez suddenly stopped denying the allegations. Instead, he began to talk slowly at first, then with disturbing ease. What he revealed sent shockwaves through the investigation. Lopez confessed to taking the lives of hundreds of young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He described his actions in unsettling detail, explaining how he had perfected his methods over the years. His words were not those of a remorseful man, but of someone who took pride in his ability to evade capture for so long. The unbelievable numbers. As the confession unfolded, authorities struggled to process the scale of his crimes. Lopez claimed responsibility for at least 110 disappearances in Ecuador, 100 in Colombia, and 100 more in Peru. These numbers, if true, would make him one of the most prolific offenders in history. To verify his claims, authorities decided to take an unusual step. They asked Lopez to lead them to some of his victims' burial sites. Shockingly, he complied. The search for evidence. Under heavy police escort, Lopez was taken to multiple locations in rural Ecuador. As authorities dug into the earth, they made a horrifying discovery exactly where he had indicated. They found remains matching his descriptions. The sheer number of sites he identified further solidified his confession, proving that he had been operating for years without detection. The evidence was overwhelming. Authorities had finally captured the man responsible for the nightmares of hundreds of families. But while justice seemed inevitable, the legal system would soon reveal shocking loopholes that allowed Lopez to escape the fate he truly deserved. The trial begins. With a confession, physical evidence, and a growing public outcry, Pedro Alonso López was officially charged. His trial was one of the most significant in Ecuador's history, drawing international attention. The people demanded answers. Had he gone unnoticed for so long? How had so many lives been lost before law enforcement took action? Yet, despite the undeniable proof, Lopez's fate would take an unexpected and deeply unsettling turn. Legal restrictions, outdated sentencing laws, and systemic failures would soon allow him to slip through the cracks of justice. What should have been a life sentence would instead become one of the most shocking failures in criminal history. The world would soon learn that even monsters can walk free. Escape into the unknown. After years of evading justice, Pedro Alonso López was finally captured in Ecuador, where he confessed to his crimes in disturbing detail. The evidence against him was overwhelming his own admissions. The discovery of multiple graves, and the sheer scale of missing person reports that matched his movements across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. The case seemed closed. Justice, at last, appeared to be within reach. But what happened next defied all logic. A sentence too short. Despite the magnitude of his crimes, Lopez was sentenced to just 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. The revelation shocked the public and outraged families of the victims. How could someone responsible for so much devastation serve less time than many convicted of far lesser offenses? The legal system, flawed and outdated, failed to account for the scale of his actions. Unlike other countries that imposed life sentences or capital punishment for such crimes, Ecuador's laws placed strict limits on incarceration periods, even for the most severe offenses. López had admitted to taking hundreds of lives, yet he would serve only a fraction of the time many expected. The world reacts. As news of his sentencing spread, outrage grew beyond Ecuador's borders. International media outlets reported on the case, highlighting the shortcomings of the legal system. Families of the victims demanded change, urging lawmakers to prevent similar injustices in the future. But for López, prison was not a punishment, it was merely a waiting period. Behind bars, he remained calm, knowing that his time in captivity would eventually come to an end. Unlike other inmates who feared life behind bars, he knew that freedom was inevitable, the day he walked free. In 1994, after serving just 14 years, López was released 2 years early for good behavior. The decision sent shockwaves through the community. Many believed he would remain behind bars indefinitely, but instead, he stepped out of prison a free man, walking away with little to no surveillance. Authorities attempted to deport him back to Colombia, hoping he would be retried under stricter laws, but even that effort fell apart. Colombian officials initially arrested him on charges related to a prior case, but later released him on bail. From that moment on, Pedro Alonso López disappeared. Theories and speculations. What happened to López after his release remains one of the most chilling mysteries in modern crime history. Multiple theories have surfaced over the years. Continued crimes. Some believe López changed his identity and resumed his crimes in another region. With his ability to evade capture and manipulate those around him, it's possible he continued to operate under a new identity, vigilante justice. Others suspect that he never truly walked free. Rumors suggest that he was targeted by those seeking revenge, family members of victims, or even underground groups determined to stop him permanently. Living in hiding. There are theories that López lives in complete anonymity, perhaps under a new name, in a remote location where no one knows his past. Some reports claim he was last seen in Colombia, but no concrete evidence supports these claims. The legacy of his escape. The failure to keep López behind bars remains one of the most glaring mistakes in criminal justice history. His case has been cited in debates about sentencing laws, international criminal investigations, and the importance of cross-border cooperation in tracking fugitives. To this day, his whereabouts remain unknown. No verified sightings, no confirmed arrests, just rumors and speculation. If he is still alive, he would be in his mid-70s, potentially living under a different name, escaping the consequences of his past. One thing is certain, the name Pedro Alonso López will forever be associated with one of the greatest failures of the justice system. The monster of the Andes vanished, but the fear he left behind still lingers. Psychological profiling. Understanding the mind of a predator, Pedro Alonso López was not just a criminal, was a calculated predator who evaded capture for years. To understand how he operated, criminal psychologists have studied his behaviors, patterns, and confessions, attempting to uncover what drove him to commit such heinous acts. The making of a predator, criminal psychologists suggest that López's early experiences shaped his dangerous mindset. From childhood abandonment to abuse and exposure to extreme violence, he developed a worldview where control and dominance became his means of survival. Rather than developing empathy, he learned to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately harm others without remorse. His ability to gain the trust of his victims demonstrates a deep understanding of human psychology. He did not use brute force to capture his victims. Instead, he relied on persuasion, appearing as a harmless figure before revealing his true intentions. This level of manipulation is a key trait among some of the most dangerous offenders in history, a lack of remorse. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of López's confessions was his complete lack of guilt. He spoke about his crimes with an unsettling level of detachment, as if he were recounting ordinary events rather than describing acts of violence. This absence of remorse is a common characteristic in individuals diagnosed with psychopathy, a condition marked by a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and manipulative tendencies. One of the most disturbing elements of his confessions was his belief that he was providing his victims with mercy. He claimed that his actions spared them from lives of suffering, a twisted justification that highlights the depths of his psychological disorder. This warped sense of morality allowed him to continue his crimes without internal conflict. The calculated approach, unlike impulsive criminals who act on sudden urges, López was methodical. He planned his actions carefully, choosing victims who were less likely to be missed, and avoiding areas where law enforcement was more active. His ability to operate undetected across multiple countries demonstrates a high level of intelligence in evasion tactics. Investigators later noted that López studied his surroundings before committing his crimes. He would observe daily routines, identify weak points in security, and move strategically to avoid suspicion. This level of planning suggests he understood the risks and actively worked to minimize them, making him an exceptionally dangerous individual. Theories on his whereabouts. Since his release in 1998, López has remained a mystery. Experts believe there are three main possibilities regarding his fate. 1. He continued his crimes elsewhere. Given his history, it is likely that López resumed his activities under a new identity in a different region. However, no confirmed reports have surfaced to link him to recent cases. 2. He was met with vigilante justice. Some believe that after his release, individuals seeking revenge may have taken matters into their own hands, ensuring he would never harm anyone again. 3. He went into hiding. Given his ability to evade authorities in the past, López may have assumed a new identity and disappeared into a remote area, avoiding detection. The lasting impact. The case of Pedro Alonso López remains one of the most terrifying reminders of the failures within the justice system. His ability to evade capture, serve a minimal sentence, and disappear without a trace has left many questioning how such a thing could happen. For the families of his victims, closure remains elusive. Without knowing his true fate, the fear of his return lingers. His story has influenced changes in law enforcement practices, international cooperation in criminal investigations, and the study of criminal psychology. Despite decades passing since his last confirmed sighting, the search for the monster of the Andes continues. His name is etched into history as one of the most disturbing cases of all time, a case that proves that sometimes even the most dangerous individuals can slip through the cracks of justice. The mystery remains unsolved. The victims' voices, remembering those who were lost. Pedro Alonso López's crimes left behind a devastating impact, one that extends far beyond statistics and crime reports. Each number represents a life, a child with dreams, a family shattered, a community left in mourning. While much of the media coverage has focused on López himself, the true weight of this case lies in the stories of those he took from the world too soon, the forgotten victims. The majority of López's victims came from impoverished communities across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Many were young girls between the ages of 8 and 12, targeted because of their vulnerability and the systemic neglect that left them unprotected. These children often worked in markets, helped their families in the fields, or roamed streets where safety was never guaranteed. For years, families reported their daughters missing, only to be met with indifference from local authorities. In many cases, parents were told their children had likely run away, or that there was little that could be done without direct evidence of wrongdoing. The lack of urgency allowed López to continue his crimes without immediate fear of being caught. The families left behind. The grief of losing a child is immeasurable. For the families of López's victims, that grief was compounded by the lack of justice. Many waited years for answers, only to be met with silence. Even after his arrest, the short sentence he served felt like a betrayal, as if the lives lost were not valued by the system meant to protect them. Mothers and fathers who spent years searching for their daughters were left with nothing but questions. How could such a tragedy go unnoticed for so long? How did one man manage to inflict so much suffering without being stopped? The emotional scars remain, passed down through generations, as a painful reminder of a justice system that failed them. The unmarked graves. When authorities finally uncovered the burial sites identified by López, they were faced with a heartbreaking reality: many of the victims would never be identified. The passage of time, exposure to the elements, and the lack of forensic resources meant that many remains could not be linked to specific families. These children, whose lives were taken in secrecy, were denied even the dignity of a proper burial. Mass graves in rural areas became grim reminders of the atrocities that took place. While some families were able to find closure through the identification of their loved ones, many others remained trapped in uncertainty, forever wondering if their missing child was among those found. A legacy of fear. The communities affected by Lopez's crimes were forever changed. Parents became more protective, children were warned never to speak to strangers, and a deep sense of distrust toward outsiders lingered long after his capture. The psychological toll of living in fear, of knowing a predator walked among them for years, left an impact that still resonates today. For those who survived the era of Lopez's terror, the fear has never truly faded. Even with the passage of time, the question of whether he could still be out there remains an unsettling thought. Honoring the victims. While the world remembers the name of Pedro Alonso López, it is crucial to also remember the lives he stole. Each victim had a Futura story that was never fully written. By acknowledging them, sharing their stories, and ensuring their voices are not lost to history, we can honor their memory in a way that goes beyond the horror of their final moments. Their names may not all be known, but their presence is felt in the fight for justice, in the reforms made to protect future generations, and in the demand for a world where such crimes are never ignored again. The victims must never be forgotten. The impact on Latin America. Fear, anger, and injustice. Pedro Alonso López's crimes were not just a tragedy for the families of his victims. They were a wake-up call for an entire region. The case exposed deep flaws in law enforcement, judicial systems, and the lack of communication between countries when dealing with serial offenders. It also left behind a lasting fear in communities that once believed their children were safe. A shock to the system. Before Lopez's crimes came to light, many communities in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru operated under the belief that such acts of violence were rare. While crime was not uncommon, the sheer scale of Lopez's offenses forced authorities to confront a horrifying reality. Their systems were not equipped to handle such threats. Many missing person reports had been dismissed or ignored, allowing him to continue his actions for years. His ability to cross borders undetected also highlighted the lack of cooperation between law enforcement agencies in different countries. By the time authorities realized the pattern, hundreds of lives had already been lost. Fear and mistrust. In the aftermath of Lopez's arrest and shocking confession, fear gripped the communities where he had operated. Parents became more protective of their children, restricting their movements and instilling a deep sense of caution. Schools, marketplaces, and small towns that once felt safe were now clouded by suspicion. The fear wasn't just about Lopez, it was about the possibility of others like him. If someone could commit such crimes without being detected for so long, how many others had slipped through the cracks? The idea that a single predator could cause so much harm made people question whether justice systems were truly designed to protect them. Outrage over his sentence. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was the legal outcome. Despite confessing to the deaths of over 300 victims, Lopez was sentenced to only 16 years in prison, the maximum penalty under Ecuadorian law at the time. To many, this was an insult to justice. When he was released early for good behavior, the outrage intensified. Protests erupted, demanding reforms to sentencing laws, especially for crimes of such magnitude. The case fueled debates about whether serial offenders should be eligible for early release, or whether special laws should be introduced for particularly heinous crimes. Changes in law enforcement. While Lopez's case revealed massive failures in the system, it also led to crucial reforms in law enforcement practices. Improved tracking of missing persons. Authorities in multiple Latin American countries introduced better systems for tracking and investigating missing person reports, particularly those involving children. Cross-border cooperation. Increased collaboration between law enforcement agencies in different countries helped prevent criminals from evading justice simply by crossing a border. Harsher sentencing laws. In some regions, legal reforms were pushed to prevent dangerous offenders from receiving lenient sentences or early release. While these changes came too late for Lopez's victims, they have played a role in preventing similar cases from going unnoticed. A lingering shadow. Despite the changes in law enforcement and public awareness, The case of Pedro Alonso López remains an unsettling reminder of the vulnerabilities that still exist. His disappearance after his release leaves open the terrifying possibility that he could have continued his crimes elsewhere. For the families of his victims, justice was never truly served. Many still live with unanswered questions, and the pain of knowing that the man responsible for their suffering was never held accountable in the way he should have been. The unsolved mystery. The greatest tragedy of this case is not just the crimes themselves, but the uncertainty that remains. Where did Pedro Alonso López go after his release? Did he continue to harm others? Was he truly stopped? Or is he still out there, living under a new identity? The case of the monster of the Andes is a haunting reminder that justice is not always served, and that some questions may never be answered. But one thing remains clear: his crimes changed Latin America forever, leaving behind a legacy of fear, demand for change, and a commitment to never allowing such horror to happen again. The hunt for truth. Investigative journalism and López's disappearance. After Pedro Alonso López was released from prison in 1998, the world was left with one burning question: where did he go? With no confirmed sightings and no official records of his whereabouts, journalists, investigators, and true crime enthusiasts set out to uncover the truth. What followed was a decades-long search filled with speculation, conflicting reports, and an unsettling reality. One of the world's most notorious predators had vanished without a trace. The last confirmed record of López places him in Colombia shortly after his release. Authorities detained him briefly on an old warrant related to a different case, raising hopes that he would remain in custody. However, to the disbelief of many, he was released on bail, and from that moment forward, he disappeared. Despite efforts to track him down, no official documentation exists of his whereabouts. His ability to move undetected raises serious concerns about how easily a known criminal could slip through legal systems. This lack of oversight left investigators with nothing but rumors and unreliable leads. Reported sightings, fact or fiction. Over the years, multiple unverified sightings of López have surfaced. 2002. A report suggested that López had been spotted in the border regions of Colombia and Ecuador, possibly living under a new identity. No concrete evidence supported this claim. 2005. A journalist received an anonymous tip that López was residing in Peru, allegedly blending into remote communities where law enforcement was scarce. Again, no proof was found. 2010. A retired police officer claimed that López had been killed by vigilantes who sought revenge for his past crimes. Without a body or any forensic confirmation, this theory remains speculation. Despite these claims, no law enforcement agency has confirmed a verified sighting since his release. It is as if he simply ceased to exist. Why is he so hard to find? López's ability to remain undetected raises several possibilities. 1. He changed his identity. With minimal documentation requirements in some rural areas, he may have acquired false identification and started a new life where no one recognizes him. 2. He lives in isolated communities. Many remote villages in South America lack police presence, making them ideal hiding places for someone who wants to disappear. 3. He is no longer alive. While there is no confirmed evidence of his death, many believe that he was quietly eliminated by individuals seeking justice outside the legal system. The role of investigative journalism. In the absence of law enforcement efforts, investigative journalists have played a crucial role in keeping the search for López alive. True crime researchers, documentary filmmakers, and independent reporters have followed leads, interviewed former officials, and revisited case files to piece together what might have happened. Documentaries and books about the case continue to explore theories about his fate. Some journalists believe that governments may have quietly closed the case, unwilling to admit that they lost track of such a dangerous individual. Others argue that López may have paid off officials to remain free, taking advantage of corrupt systems that allowed him to slip away unnoticed. Could he still be out there? If López is still alive, he would be in his mid-70s today. While many serial offenders slow down with age, history has shown that some continue their crimes well into their later years. The idea that he could still be preying on vulnerable individuals is an unsettling possibility that cannot be ignored. Authorities across Latin America have been urged to reopen the case and conduct further investigations. However, without new evidence, efforts remain stalled. The mystery of Pedro Alonso López's disappearance is one of the most chilling aspects of his story. Whether he is dead or alive, the unanswered questions continue to haunt the families of his victims and the communities he once terrorized. The search continues. Despite decades passing since his release, the hunt for López is far from over. Investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts continue to search for the truth, refusing to let the case fade into obscurity. But until undeniable proof emerges, one terrifying fact remains. The monster of the Andes may still be out there. Theories and speculations. Where could he be? Decades have passed since Pedro Alonso López was last seen, yet the mystery surrounding his fate continues to fuel speculation. How could one of the most dangerous criminals in history simply disappear? While no concrete evidence has emerged to confirm his whereabouts, various theories attempt to answer the chilling question. Where is Pedro Alonso López today? Theory 1. He changed his identity and resumed his crimes. One of the most feared possibilities is that López assumed a new identity and continued his crimes elsewhere. Given his history of moving between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru undetected, it is possible that he relocated to another region where his past was unknown. Several factors support this theory. López had a deep understanding of how to avoid detection, having successfully evaded authorities for years. Many remote villages in South America lack strong law enforcement, making it easier for criminals to operate without suspicion. Other infamous offenders in history have managed to disappear and continue their crimes under new identities. If this theory is correct, it raises the horrifying possibility that he continued preying on vulnerable individuals well after his release. Theory 2. He was killed by vigilantes. Another widely circulated theory suggests that López was murdered by vigilantes seeking revenge for his crimes. This idea stems from reports that many people, especially those who lost loved ones, were outraged when he was released after serving only 14 years in prison. There have been unverified claims that he was tracked down and executed in a remote area, far from the reach of authorities. If true, this could explain why no further crimes have been linked to him, and why no official records exist of his whereabouts. However, without any physical evidence or official reports, this theory remains speculation. Theory 3. He was secretly arrested or institutionalized. Some believe that López was quietly rearrested or placed in a mental institution under a different name, away from public knowledge. This theory suggests that authorities, embarrassed by the failure to keep him imprisoned, may have chosen to deal with him discreetly rather than making headlines again. While possible, there is no known record to confirm that López was ever taken into custody after his release. If such an action occurred, it has been kept secret for decades. Theory 4. He died in hiding. Given that López would be in his mid-70s today, it is entirely possible that he passed away in secrecy. Life on the run can be difficult, especially for someone without legal identification or stable shelter. If he did indeed flee to a remote area, he may have succumbed to illness, injury, or even an unrecorded attack. The lack of confirmed sightings for over 2 decades lends credibility to this theory, but until evidence surfaces, his fate remains unknown. Why hasn't he been found? The disappearance of Pedro Alonso López highlights serious flaws in international criminal investigations. There are several reasons why no one has been able to track him down. Lack of international coordination. Since his crimes spanned multiple countries, law enforcement agencies would need to work together to locate him, a challenge that has historically been difficult in South America. Poor record keeping. Many missing persons and criminal records in the regions where López operated are incomplete or outdated, making it easy for individuals to vanish without a trace. No recent crimes linked to him. If López did continue his activities, he has either been exceptionally careful or changed his methods to avoid detection. The continuing search. Despite the passage of time, law enforcement agencies and independent investigators continue to search for answers. True crime enthusiasts and journalists have attempted to retrace his steps, analyzing past cases for possible links to new disappearances. Many believe that if López is still alive, he will eventually make a mistake one that will bring his story back into the spotlight. Until then, the case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of modern times, a legacy of fear. The uncertainty surrounding Lopez's fate has left an unsettling impact on those who remember his crimes. The possibility that he could still be alive, living under a false name, or even continuing his activities is a terrifying thought for the families of his victims and the communities he once terrorized. While the world may never know the full truth, one fact remains clear. Pedro Alonso López's crimes will never be forgotten. The hunt for the monster of the Andes continues. The justice system's failure. Why wasn't he stopped? The case of Pedro Alonso López remains one of the most shocking failures of the justice system in modern history. Despite his chilling confession, the overwhelming evidence against him, and the sheer scale of his crimes, he was allowed to walk free. This chapter examines the critical flaws in the legal system that enabled a predator of his magnitude to escape true justice. A legal system not prepared for such crimes. At the time of Lopez's arrest, Ecuadorian law had a maximum sentence of only 16 years 7 for the most severe crimes. This outdated sentencing guideline failed to account for individuals like Lopez, whose crimes were beyond comprehension. Despite admitting to over 300 victims, he was only convicted for a fraction of them due to limitations in forensic investigations. Instead of being sentenced to life imprisonment, he received the maximum penalty allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. To make matters worse, he was released early for what was classified as good behavior. The failure to keep him behind bars demonstrated a fundamental weakness in sentencing laws, particularly in cases involving extreme offenders. International law enforcement failures. Lopez's ability to operate across 3 countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, showed the lack of cooperation between law enforcement agencies in South America. There was no centralized criminal database, no coordinated effort to track his movements, and no immediate exchange of information between countries. By the time officials in one country identified him as a suspect, he had already moved to another jurisdiction, taking advantage of weak border control and poor interagency communication. If stronger cross-border criminal investigations had existed, authorities might have been able to stop him much earlier. The failure to monitor him after his release. Perhaps the most devastating failure came after Lopez served his sentence. In 1994, he was released after serving only 14 years, 12 years less than his original sentence. Authorities made a half-hearted attempt to deport him to Colombia, where he could have faced new charges, but Colombian officials released him on bail due to legal loopholes. From that moment forward, he disappeared without any supervision, parole restrictions, or tracking. It is incomprehensible that someone with his history was allowed to walk free without any monitoring. No government agency took responsibility for ensuring that he would not continue his crimes elsewhere. Why wasn't he tried for more crimes? One of the most frequently asked questions about the case is, why wasn't Lopez charged with more crimes? The answer lies in a combination of factors. Lack of forensic evidence. Many of his victims were buried in remote locations, making it difficult to connect specific cases to him. Statute of limitations. Some legal systems had time limits on prosecuting crimes, preventing new charges from being filed after a certain number of years. Corruption and inefficiency. Some suspect that bribes or bureaucratic failures may have played a role in his eventual release. These loopholes meant that, despite his own chilling confessions, justice was never fully served. The public outcry and calls for change. When news broke that Lopez had been released, public outrage exploded. Victims' families demanded reforms to prevent similar cases from happening again. While some countries have since increased their sentencing limits, Lopez's case remains a dark reminder of how dangerous legal loopholes can be. Some of the reforms that were influenced by this case include stronger sentencing laws for violent crimes in Latin America, improved tracking of high-risk offenders to prevent them from disappearing after release, increased cross-border cooperation for law enforcement agencies handling international criminals, a justice system that failed hundreds. The release of Pedro Alonso López is considered one of the greatest failures in criminal justice history. Hundreds of victims will never receive justice. He was given an opportunity to disappear on that he took. He may have continued his crimes without ever being caught again. The fact that he vanished without a trace is not just a reflection of his ability to evade law enforcement, it is a damning indictment of a system that was unable to stop him in the first place. Could this happen again? While many reforms have been made since Lopez's case, loopholes still exist in many justice systems worldwide. Countries with weak sentencing laws, poor international cooperation, and corruption remain vulnerable to similar failures. The world may never know exactly what happened to Pedro Alonso López after his release, but one thing is certain: he should never have been allowed to walk free. The justice system failed once. The question now is, will it fail again? A monster's legacy. The lasting influence of Pedro Alonso López. The crimes of Pedro Alonso López left an indelible mark on the history of criminal justice, shaping how law enforcement, forensic science, and public awareness address violent offenders today. While the man himself may have disappeared, his story continues to serve as a grim warning of what can happen when justice systems fail and international cooperation is lacking. The psychological study of extreme offenders. Lopez's case has been extensively studied by forensic psychologists and criminologists to understand the mind of a high-profile predator who operated undetected for years. His ability to manipulate, deceive, and evade authorities suggests a level of intelligence and planning that is not commonly seen. Criminal profiling advancements. His case contributed to the study of profiling serial offenders who target multiple locations and cross international borders. Understanding psychopathy. López displayed many traits associated with psychopathy, including lack of remorse, manipulation, and a disturbing ability to justify his actions. Behavioral warning signs. Psychologists continue to analyze his childhood and development to identify early indicators of extreme antisocial behavior. Changes in international law enforcement. López's ability to move freely between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru without being caught for years highlighted severe gaps in cross-border policing. His case has since influenced changes in how law enforcement agencies collaborate to track high-risk offenders. Interpol and international databases. Many countries have improved their shared databases for tracking individuals involved in violent crimes. Criminal extradition agreements. His case exposed flaws in how countries handled extradition requests for serious offenders. Stronger border security measures. Governments have strengthened their ability to monitor and restrict known offenders from crossing into new jurisdictions. Media's role in spreading awareness. The media played a significant role in ensuring that López's crimes were not forgotten. Documentaries, investigative reports, and crime series have continued to keep his case in the public eye, reinforcing the need for justice reform and increased vigilance against similar predators. True crime documentaries. Several major investigative productions have explored his case in depth, uncovering new details and theories. Journalistic investigations. Ongoing reporting has helped maintain public awareness, keeping pressure on authorities to continue looking for answers. Online communities. True crime enthusiasts and independent researchers have used digital platforms to share theories and information, keeping the case active even decades after his last known sighting. The fear that still lingers. Despite the passage of time, the fear López instilled has not faded. His story serves as a chilling reminder of how easily a determined predator can exploit weaknesses in law enforcement and judicial systems. Communities still affected. The towns where he operated continue to feel the weight of his crimes, with many families still searching for closure. Survivor awareness. His case has influenced how parents and communities educate children about personal safety and the dangers of trusting strangers. Law enforcement training. Many police forces now include case studies on offenders like López to better understand how such individuals operate and evade capture. Could there be others like him? Perhaps the most disturbing question that remains is, could another predator like Pedro Alonso López still exist today? While law enforcement has improved significantly since his time, gaps still exist in global criminal tracking. Serial offenders who operate across multiple countries remain difficult to detect, particularly in regions with poor investigative resources. Unsolved cases. Hundreds of missing person reports remain open across Latin America, raising fears that similar crimes could be happening undetected. Modern-day loopholes. Weak sentencing laws, corruption, and lack of coordination between international agencies continue to create risks for repeat offenders. The evolution of criminal behavior. With advancements in technology, criminals now have access to new ways of evading capture, making modern investigations even more complex. The final thought: a case that haunts the world, Pedro Alonso López, remains an unsettling enigma. Whether he is alive or dead, his legacy is one of unanswered questions, systemic failures, and unimaginable horror. His crimes force society to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, and his escape from justice remains one of the greatest failures in modern criminal history. His case serves as a reminder of the importance of justice, vigilance, and reform, because as long as loopholes exist, there will always be those willing to exploit them. The world may never know the full truth about what happened to the monster of the Andes, but what we do know is that his crimes must never be forgotten. A case that haunts the world. The case of Pedro Alonso López is more than just a terrifying true crime story. It is a dark reflection of a justice system that failed. From his shocking crimes to his inexplicable release, his story raises urgent questions about law enforcement, international cooperation, and the ongoing fight to protect vulnerable individuals from dangerous predators. What we know for certain, Pedro Alonso López confessed to committing more than 300 crimes against young victims across 3 countries: Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He was sentenced to only 16 years in prison in Ecuador, the maximum sentence allowed at the time, despite the scale of his crimes. He was released early for good behavior after serving just 14 years. After his release, he vanished, and to this day, his whereabouts remain unknown. The unanswered questions. Despite decades of investigation, many questions remain unanswered. Is Pedro Alonso López still alive? If so, where is he now? Did he continue his crimes after his release? Given his history, it is likely that he did not simply stop. Was he killed by vigilantes or criminals? Many believe that, after his release, he was tracked down and eliminated by those seeking justice outside the law. Did authorities secretly imprison him under another identity? Some suspect that governments, unwilling to admit failure, may have quietly taken action to ensure he never harmed anyone again. Why this case still matters. Even after all these years, the case of Pedro Alonso López remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. His ability to avoid justice, manipulate the legal system, and ultimately disappear into obscurity serves as a warning about the failures of international law enforcement. His crimes also remind us of the importance of justice reform, victim advocacy, and global efforts to track dangerous offenders. While laws have changed since his capture, loopholes still exist, and the risk of similar cases happening again remains real. Could it happen again? With advancements in forensic science, digital tracking, and international policing, one might assume that a case like López's could never happen today. But the truth is that criminals continue to find ways to exploit weak legal systems. Human trafficking networks operate across borders with little interference. Criminals change identities and relocate to regions with minimal law enforcement oversight. Justice systems in some countries still offer lenient sentences for serious crimes, allowing repeat offenders to walk free. The lessons from López's case must continue to influence global crime prevention strategies. A name that will never be forgotten, Pedro Alonso López is often left out of conversations about the world's most infamous criminals. His name does not hold the same mainstream recognition as figures like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. Yet, his crimes were far worse, his victim count far higher, and his ability to escape justice far more disturbing. While the world may never know what truly became of him, his crimes will never be forgotten. They live on, in the continued search for justice, in the families who still seek answers, and in the cautionary tales used to train law enforcement officers worldwide. The hunt continues until undeniable proof emerges of his fate. Pedro Alonso López remains an open case. Investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts continue searching for the truth, refusing to let his story fade into history. The world may never get the closure it seeks, but one undeniable fact remains. The monster of the Andes should never have been allowed to walk free, and until justice is truly served, the case of Pedro Alonso López will remain one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of all time. This concludes the investigation into Pedro Alonso López. If new evidence ever surfaces, the world will once again turn its attention to the case that should have never been left open. Until then, the mystery remains. Will he ever be found? Or has the monster of the Andes disappeared forever? While the world continues to speculate about the fate of Pedro Alonso López, the families of his victims live with an unbearable reality. Justice was never fully served. The pain of losing a child, of not knowing their final moments, and of seeing their murderer walk free, is a wound that never truly heals. For them, the search for truth is not about curiosity, but about closure. Many still hold on to the hope that new information will one day emerge, providing long overdue justice for the innocent lives taken. Their voices, their grief, and their resilience must never be forgotten. Behind every headline and every documentary about this case are real families who deserve more than just unanswered questions. They deserve to be heard, to be remembered, and most of all, to see a world where tragedies like this can never happen again. The search for Pedro Alonso López may never end, but one thing remains clear: we must never forget those who are lost.